This is me getting ready to record the Ministry Backpack podcast. I don't know what my hand is doing there. Sorry about that. So this is kind of behind the scenes. So I may edit this a little bit. So yeah, I probably will. Here's the thing. I'm going to be recording a couple of segments, and today is a feature episode. And so this I may just post as just as a YouTube video. That is the longer unedited version, but the podcast itself is always going to be edited for time. There's a lot of reasons for that. I may go into that down the road, but anyway, so today, probably not too exciting, but there will be other things as a part of this podcast, probably that might be interesting. So I'm just trying to create a different way to consume this content, another way to follow along. So anyway, so I'm going to start, and I'm going to record the opener, and I do that, by the way, in Audacity. So here we go. Ministry Backpack Podcast, episode number 45. Hello, ministry leaders. Thanks for joining me today. I hope that you've had an amazing Easter. Easter is one of those times, that I never know. I mean, in the month of April, I post a podcast sometimes, and other times I don't, or there's very little, just because I know that so many people in ministry are already so busy with all of the things going into Easter that I don't know if they're going to even listen to it. And if they do, it's probably going to be something they listen to much later. But so this time I'm recording this after Easter. And I wanted to mention that this year, many of you know that I'm a church planter here in Aurora, Colorado. And our Easter celebration this year was very different from what we've done in the past. We often, we usually do a really big thing on Easter, and for some reason, and I think it has a lot to do with the unchurched kind of mindset here in this part of Colorado, that is so different from, for example, Fort Worth, although it may be changing now. It's kind of changing like this all over the place, but I remember back in Fort Worth, Easter was like a big deal that the community, even people who weren't normally in church, would just show up at Easter, right? It was some kind of way to come back to church, or a nod to their mom and dad or family, and they would all show up at Easter. And so there would always be this huge thing, you'd have 10 services and dancing bears and fireworks, and whatever you could to do a really huge, big celebration of the resurrection on that day. And to connect with the people who aren't normally there. But what I've discovered since I've been here for the past couple of years, just trying to connect with not just church people, but unchurched people primarily, is that Easter is here not a big draw. It's kind of like just another holiday that happens on a weekend. A lot of people just, get together maybe with their family, but church is not even on the radar. So many times we've tried to do a big thing, a big egg hunt or whatever, and just to try and attract a few people to be a part of our Easter celebration. But we've just not had a bump. We've not had a bump in attendance or anything during Easter. So this year we just kind of rolled with that, and instead just had what ended up being a wonderful celebration of the resurrection, and a very special time. We had just a big brunch at where we meet normally, but it wasn't in our big Sunday type setting. And we do a big Sunday once a month where we use worship musicians and all of that. I don't think I've ever really explained that on the podcast, but so this year we did something, it was all pared down. It was all a smaller setup, but the big part of it was just we had a big breakfast brunch kind of thing, and then I shared some stuff. shared some stuff. I spoke for a few minutes, and what was weird is we had some things happen. I mean, the the breakers kept tripping, and we were like frying bacon and having eggs and pancakes and things, and so we had several delays as we had to sort of repair that situation. But then I spoke briefly in front of the. I'm going to get a distraction here. Yeah. All right. All is well. Anyway, so I spoke briefly at the table, but here's the deal. I really felt like I did a pretty poor job of that. So, hang on just a second. Michael, are you in the hallway? Holy cow. Where was I? So I thought I did kind of a poor job, really. I looked up and I saw, because of all the delays we had because of the breakers being thrown and that sort of thing, that I was in a hurry. And so I sounded kind of like an auctioneer. I was speaking so fast. And by the time we got done, I just felt like I had not done a very good job at Easter. So I was a bit discouraged by that. And at the same time being encouraged by what we were doing. It was successful. Everybody was having an awesome experience. And we didn't have a whole lot of new visitors, as I suspected, so it was the right call. Interestingly enough, we are actually doing our bigger celebration this coming Sunday. So the week after Easter is what just fell on the Sunday that we normally do Big Sunday. All right. Well, anyway, today on the podcast, it is a feature episode, and I'm going to be covering one of the backpack essentials for Christian leaders that, again, like many of these others, is one of those things that you wouldn't normally think of as an essential for being a leader in ministry. But let me just tell you, it is powerful. It's incredibly important. You don't want to do ministry without it. It's absolutely essential. And we'll talk about it right after this. Okay, so that was the recording. Hang on a second here. Maybe I can show you my screen. Let me try that for just a second. All right. Let's try this. Whoa. Okay, that's not what I thought was going to happen, but let's see here. You know what? I think I'm not going to do that until I know what I'm doing. I'm going to stop that. Come back to me. Yeah, just freestyling. That was a mistake. Okay. All right. Let me take care of this quick file. I'm in Audacity, and basically I'm going to export what I just recorded as a WAV file. And I'm going to put that into my ministry backpack folder for the podcast. Yeah, sorry about this. That's what I meant. This is how exciting. But I have to do this before I can go on to the next segment. Ministry backpack, and then it's in a folder that I have a basic folder for the podcast, and in it I have all kinds of other folders, intros and endings. I have the feature episodes. I have the full episodes for when everything transition. I'm putting this file. WAV file of the still have this guy, the little dude that I found. I think I'm gonna throw him into the dishwasher, clean him up. If any of you guys know what this is, what character this is supposed to be, I don't know. I found him on the ground. You know, let me know. All right, now I'm going to close that file, and then I'm going to get ready to start a new one. And again, I usually edit these pretty heavily, and mostly it's because I just start rambling and things. And so some of the hiccups you might see in the podcast are that. I mean, it's me just kind of chopping. Sometimes when I do a feature, it might be 30 or 40 minutes long. But in the end, the edited version, nice and clean, and the levels and everything set, that might be trimmed down to 15 minutes or so, or 20 minutes or so. Okay. So I am using basically my notes from the book I'm working on called 15 Backpack Essentials for Christian Leaders. And the essential I'm talking about today is the 11th of the 15. So I've actually kind of touched on these in the podcast a number of times. Pardon? Take a little drink. This is coffee, by the way. And by the way, you can get these mugs. There is a link to get a cool one. Designed by my daughter Melissa, by the way. This cool logo. And on the back, ministry is an adventure. So strap on your backpack and let's get going. That's the line on here. This is my favorite mug. Anyway, back to what I was talking about. This is what I'm talking about right there. Okay, so I'm going to record in Audacity again the content of this. Now I need to put on my glasses because just so I can see my notes here. All right. So anyhow, this is not live, by the way. I'm going to be posting this later. So, I mean, if you ask me a question in the comments, I will respond to to your questions and to your comments. But just remember, this is not a live thing, even though it looks kind of like it is. All right. So get my head together. Back to Audacity first. And I always, when I record anything, and again, this setup is no big, expensive setup, as you can see. I do a lot of post-recording stuff to try and fix it. But from day one, that's what I've said about the podcast, is that it is, the audio quality of this podcast varies, just like in real life, is what I say. So I know how important audio is. I know how important it is to sound great. But I am not, I'm not in a big studio or anything. I mean, you were in the Ministry Backpack Studios, which is just, right now is just a part of the room in our living room in our condo here in Aurora. So, all right. So how many times can I say, all right? So what I was saying is when I start the recording, I hit record and then I get silent for a few minutes. And that is to provide sort of a test segment that's catching all of the ambient weird noise in the room right now, so that I can try and remove that later. I can use that as the sample. All right, now we're going to go into, or I'm going to try to go into the recording. Oh, maybe I should be looking at my notes. We've been talking about backpack essentials for Christian leaders in the feature episodes over the past several months. And today I'm going to talk about one that is so unassuming. I mean, yeah, I'm going to cut that out for sure. Let's start that again. All right. We've been talking about backpack essentials for some time now here on the podcast in these feature episodes, and they've all come from 2 Corinthians chapter 6, where Paul is defending his apostleship. He's defending to the church in Corinth that he is actually from God. He has authority from God. He should be listened to. He's worthy of following. And so each of these things that he describes, they're not biographical. Paul sometimes would use a biographical description, being born a Jew and was, he would go back to his educational pedigree and how he had authority because of certain particular things that he had done. But in this instance, I just think it's interesting that he talks about qualities and characteristics that aren't so much biographical. They are actually things that Paul are qualities that Paul is talking about that are applicable to anyone who's a Christian leader. And I really believe that if you are going to be a Christian leader who has some authority and that has the ability to communicate in such a way and lead in such a way that has people want to follow you, in such a way that people do want to follow you and understand and can recognize right away that you are following Jesus and that you have authority as a leader, then these are the kinds of things that need to be growing and evident in your life. All right, so today I'm going to talk about today I'm going to talk about the essential that is simply called humility. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 8, the part of that verse, Paul is talking about we have proved ourselves by and he says these various things. And in verse 8, he says, through glory and dishonor. And then in verse 9, the first part of that, as unknown yet recognized. When I was a pretty young kid, I had a Sunday school teacher, and this Sunday school teacher was so awesome. He was somebody who I initially, anyway, respected and loved his family. This guy was a great teacher. He was a consistent church attender. He was always there. He was a very dedicated husband. I knew his family well. He was a loving father. He was a deacon in our church. And he was actually viewed by our church as one of the, strong leaders in our congregation. But here's the deal. Unfortunately, even with all of these great qualities and responsibilities, he was also very arrogant. He was a very arrogant man. And I remember this about him more than I even remember all the other things I just described or anything that he tried to teach me. When I think of this man now, years and years and years later, the first thing I think of is, man, he sure was arrogant. That's terrible. I mean, one of his favorite lines was, it's not bragging if you can do it. And you may have heard that expression too. And I know that often that's a line said with a wink and a smile, but he kind of meant it. It was sort of an excuse to brag. It's not bragging if you can do it. And of course, he was someone who always could do it, whatever that, it was. And even then, I saw the weakness in that statement because of the simple truth that as well, is that if you can do it, you don't have to brag about it, right? You don't even have to. It speaks for itself, whatever that it may be. Now, just to be clear, this guy was not a bad person. And again, I think I've said this already, but I really appreciated his family. I love his family. Even to this day, I value them greatly. And his life, ultimately had a great impact with a variety of people. He was a faithful follower of Jesus. But the truth is, during that period of time in my life, when I really needed someone who was a godly leader that I could look up to and learn from, he lost his ability to speak into my life with any authority because he lacked that backpack essential for Christian leaders, and that is humility. Now, here's the deal, and I have to admit this. I mean, if you were giving me a list of essentials for being great and authoritative, as a Christian leader, my first thought probably before reading through this and preparing for this and studying Scripture, my first thought would probably not be, how about humility? Who's going to be a great leader? Who's going to be awesome? Who's going to be the kind of leader that God really used? Oh, they need the quality of humility. I probably wouldn't think that. I mean, I would think, really? I mean, humility? I mean, who follows someone who's humble? I mean, doesn't that word describe somebody who is weak or someone who is timid and has no confidence? Well, no, it doesn't mean that at all. Well, let me explain. There are a few reasons why humility is a characteristic that is so important for Christian leaders. And here's one of the first ideas behind this. To not have humility in our life and leadership is to have arrogance and or pride in our life and our leadership. And this is a very bad thing. I mean, really, it's a bad thing. When you lead from arrogance or you live with arrogance and you have pride in your life, it can derail you in so many kinds of painful ways. Humility in leadership helps us to avoid the very foolish mistakes that can arise from arrogance. Now, sometimes I'll hear people say things like, well, people who lead, they always have a little bit of arrogance in them, a little bit of swagger, right? It helps them to stand out. It helps them to speak the loudest. And the one who's the loudest is usually the one that everyone is listening to. Well, I mean, sadly, there is some truth to that statement. If we're talking about leadership in social situations or to some extent, maybe even in business or in politics even sometimes. Strangely, the loudest one talking is the one people are listening to. The loudest one, yeah. But here's the thing. We're not talking about leadership in social settings. This is not what I'm talking about today. I'm not talking about leadership in a business setting. I'm not talking about leadership in a political environment. We're talking about being a Christian leader. So here's the thing. If you're a Christian leader and you are operating out of arrogance and pride, the Bible says that God is against you. Yeah, think about that. God is against you. In James 4:6 and in 1 Peter 5:5, it's stated pretty clearly that God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. I mean, seriously, if you're trying to lead as a pastor, a staff member, maybe you're a deacon, a Sunday school teacher, maybe you're on the greeting team, host team, you help, with the parking team if your church is really large, or if you're any other kind of ministry leader, and you're doing that without a sense of humility, God is not for your efforts in that. He's actually against you. And if you're leading on behalf of Jesus, you definitely don't want to be, you don't want him to be against you as you go. I mean, seriously? And if God is against you in your ministry, think about it. It isn't much of a ministry. I mean, it can get big, it can run like a well-oiled machine, and it can impress the outsiders, but it does not impress God. Because God looks upon the thoughts and the intents of our hearts, and the people that we lead, they quickly pick up on the thoughts and the intents of our hearts. Humility for Christian leaders is not a small thing. It's actually a very big thing. Humility demonstrates that we understand that we lead knowing that we are under the authority of God. And we know that it's not really our show, it's his show. It helps Christian leaders lead well. So here's Paul, and he's talking to this church in Corinth, and he's describing himself and his companions, and he uses those phrases. We have proved ourselves through glory and dishonor, and as unknown yet recognized. And by yet recognized, he's meaning yet recognized by God. So he was honored to serve and to speak on behalf of his king. He wasn't concerned about his own personal glory or recognition. I'm going to pause because there's a jet flying over here. Edit this out. It's the sound of freedom. True humility in Christian leadership, it's actually a form of grit that leads through dishonor and without desire for fame. This is because we serve at the pleasure of the king. Now remember, Paul is using his humility as a proof that he has been sent from God. He has authority as a true leader and is someone who should be followed and listened to. He's saying that he has been consistent in his heart and his attitude when people were loving his ministry and when people were not loving his ministry. He was consistent when he was thought of as an amazing minister and when nobody really even knew who he was. When they said great things about him and when they spread lies about him. I mean, he didn't care if he was the one who received the credit or if some other minister like Apollos received the credit. He understood what true honor is all about. He was fully aware of the one who gave him any authority at all, and he kept pointing people to his king. And in Christian ministry, Paul's king is also our king. And our king is and showed us the way. He set the example. I mean, think about this. Our king, Jesus, set the example in this characteristic of humility. I mean, seriously, if you're a Christian leader, are you greater than or bigger than a bigger deal than Jesus? I mean, would you ever imagine the scenario? Would you bump him out of the spotlight if he was standing physically and speaking to a group? Would you kind of bump him out of the spotlight or take the microphone away from him to attract attention to yourself? I mean, I'm hoping as you're hearing this, you're horrified at the very notion and you would just say, no, never. I would never do that. If you're a follower of Jesus and you're a leader who is a Christian, I mean, you want to follow him, you want to become like him, and you want to lead like Jesus. He's the master and we are not above him. So here's the deal. Jesus set the pace from the very beginning of his earthly presence on planet Earth. Think of this. Just think of this for a minute. The King of glory, God himself, becoming one of us, born in a stable, not a palace, appearing to shepherds before even appearing to the powerful, not laying claim to his rights and his privileges as God, but instead he served humanity and accomplished his redemptive mission. In Philippians chapter 2, he tells us to do nothing out of rivalry or conceit, but in humility to consider others as more important than yourselves. And then he commands us to make our attitude the same as his attitude. And it's described as, who existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God. Wait, I'm going to start this over because the jet is flying by again. It's really loud here. In Philippians 2, he tells us to do nothing out of rivalry or conceit, but in humility, consider others as more important than yourselves. And then he commands us to make our attitude the same as his attitude, who existing in the form of God did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant. So ultimately, that amazing humility, that characteristic, that backpack essential I'm calling humility of Jesus, made even our salvation a reality. If he didn't have that humility, the possibility of us being saved would never even exist. And Philippians 2 continues by letting us know that he humbled himself to the point of death, even to death on a cross. Here's the thing. We serve at the pleasure of the King. If you are a Christian leader, you serve at the pleasure of the King. Not just to get ahead, not just to be honored, not to be famous, not to have everybody read all of your books or to really think that you're some big deal or to have a lot of power. If you're a servant of Jesus and you are a Christian leader, you are under the authority of the King and you serve at his pleasure. Now, this is the essence of Jesus' prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. From Matthew 6:10. It's also the understanding of the Roman officer who came to Jesus requesting healing for his servant in Matthew 8 and 9. Think of it. Here it is from the CSB. Lord, the centurion replied, I'm not worthy to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I too am a man under authority, having soldiers under my command. And I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my servant, do this, and he does it. So Christian leaders must have humility if they're going to be truly effective. And that means that they really understand that they're under authority and represent the king. And sometimes that means serving in a place of honor, like a paid full-time pastor or staff member, and sometimes that means serving in a place that doesn't have the same visibility or recognition. Sometimes it means picking up and having to move across the country to somewhere, that you weren't expecting to go originally, that isn't like a really cool hot spot in ministry. Sometimes it means that the only people who see and appreciate our faithful service are the ones we serve and the Lord who sees. And sometimes it's only the Lord who sees, right? And nobody else is really seeing or appreciating our faithful service. So humility is not a word that means weakness or a lack of confidence or low self-esteem. It is a word that conveys the idea that we understand that we're under the authority of one who is greater than us. We go at his pleasure. We serve at his pleasure. We do whatever he calls us to do. Our responsibility is to see his will done rather than our will done on earth as it is in heaven. I had a professor in seminary. His name was Dr. Darrell Eldridge. He's now serves with Rockbridge Seminary. But back in the day, he told us about his very first official paid position in ministry. And he had just graduated with, I think it was a master's degree. I don't think he had gotten his doctorate yet, but it was at least his master's degree. And he was so excited to start serving on a church staff. Well, the Monday of his very first week at his new church, his new position, he's the new guy, he's got his big degree, he's got all of this stuff. He was given his first ministry assignment. And that assignment was go clean up the vomit of a kid who had thrown up in the church van the night before. So that was his big thing, What a welcome to ministry. That describes it pretty well. And here's the thing. If our king grabs a towel and tells us this is how to lead, we should immediately join him and start washing feet. I mean, if a task is given to us by the king, no matter how menial or grandiose, it is an honorable thing for us to be doing. The honor is in the fact that we are doing something on behalf of and in the name of the one who is worthy of all honor. Humility. It's a backpack essential for Christian leaders. We are not the king. We serve at the pleasure of the king. Okay, at this point, now, oops. All right, so I've finished recording that. It looks like it all recorded. I'm going to push stop on that. Now I'm going to export this file in the same way I did before, just as a WAV file. I'm going to go back and edit that later for audio. And I'm going to put that into the folder called Feature Episodes. I'm going to go ahead and give it the name. Humility. Dash a backpack essential for Christian leaders. All right, saving that as a wave. Okay. All right, so while that's going here, I'll just come back to this. So basically, that's the process of a feature episode. When I'm doing interviews with pastors for 7 questions, that's going to be the kind of deal where I use Google Hangouts as a it's like a so it's like I'm talking with that one other person. I make it a private Hangout, and then I take the audio from that and clean up the audio the best I can and add that to the podcast. So there you have it. Such as it is, let me know if this is the kind of thing that you kind of are interested in seeing. I also am happy to, I don't think I need this microphone so much anymore, but anyway, if you like this, I'll be happy to do more of this kind of thing, just sort of how these things go. The notes for that, I'm not as happy with how that turned out, really, to tell you the truth. I'm not going to record it again, but I may have to edit that down quite a bit. That was different from what I might normally do. I was literally using, not word for word, but using a big chunk out of the chapter on humility in the 15 Backpack Essentials for Christian Leaders book. So here's, I appreciate, by the way, I appreciate your prayer for me as I continue to get that project done. That's all I've got for now. So I'm going to sign off here and talk to you guys again soon.